Okay, we'll start. So, as I said, I mostly seek to understand tariffs better through this session. So, Ray Dalio is a very famous writer on global politics, monetary history, and overall just a first principles thinker. He's very good at articulating a lot of subjects. His most famous videos are a couple of videos that I really like. Yeah, if you've not already seen them, I would just recommend just checking them out on YouTube. They are like really good for somebody who's very new to economics, and it's very entertaining. It's very simple to understand. One is how the economic machine works, and the other is changing world order. And both of them are like very brilliant. Nothing to do with Bitcoin, but macroeconomics and even simple economics like microeconomics as well. So those were actually some of the early videos that I watched and started to take interest in economics and then eventually Bitcoin. Okay, I'll start reading now. As always, feel free to ask questions or share your thoughts. Don't make the mistake of thinking that what's now happening is mostly about tariffs. At this moment, a huge amount of attention is being justifiably paid to the announced tariffs and their very big impact on markets and economies, while very little attention is being paid to circumstances that caused them and the biggest disruptions that are likely still ahead. Don't get me wrong, while these tariffs announcements are very important developments, and we all know that President Trump caused them, most people are losing sight of the underlying circumstances that got him elected president and brought these tariffs about. They are also mostly overlooking the vastly more important forces that are driving just about everything, including the tariffs. So, yeah, the technical definition of tariffs is that they are taxes on imports. So, whenever a country is importing any goods, that company which is importing or selling that product to that country needs to pay an import tax. So, effectively, the price is always borne by the consumers. It's like economics 101, that no matter who is taxing, no matter what kind of tax that is, whether that's import tax, export tax, sales tax, income tax, capital gains tax, the cost is always borne by the end consumer because for any entrepreneur to do their cost analysis, to do their unit of account in their business, the tax effectively gets paid by the consumer because they need to account for it. And the tax itself gets paid to the regulatory authority which is taxing it. In this case, it is the country itself. So the public balance sheet of that country. For example, if US imposes a tariff on China, then whenever a Chinese company wants to sell a good to any US consumer, to any US company, that Chinese company has to pay a certain amount of tax, which is the tariff. So that's the tax on the import of that good, which is tariff. The far bigger, more uh, The far bigger, far more important thing to keep in mind is that we are seeing a classic breakdown of the major monetary, political, and geopolitical orders. This sort of breakdown occurs only about once in a lifetime, but they have happened many times in history when similar unsustainable conditions were in place. Yeah, all Bitcoiners understand this because Bitcoin is inherently shorting the dollar system, the entire global financial system. But in the recent times, the cracks are like getting bigger. Every month, almost now, we are seeing the cracks like being very clear. And yeah, like none of them are more clear when the president of the United States is like acting arbitrarily, slapping tariffs left and right to everybody. And if you like saw the meme that I shared on the announcement, apparently tariffs are imposed on countries where there is literally no human population. Yeah, you can like do a quick Google search on it, but the tariffs are applied to some countries where literally only penguins live. So that literally does not make any economic sense. Okay. Just took a sip. More specifically, the monetary economic order is breaking down because there is too much existing debt. The rates of adding to it are too fast, and existing capital markets and economies are supported by this unsustainably large debt. The debt is unsustainable because of the large imbalance between debtor borrowers who owe too much debt and are taking on too much debt because they are hooked on debt to finance their excesses. Example, the United States. And lender creditors like China who already hold too much of the debt and are hooked on selling their goods to the borrower debtors like the United States to sustain their economies. Yeah, so the biggest problem that Donald Trump is supposedly solving with tariffs is because the entire manufacturing industry of the US is hollowed out. And why it is hollowed out? The biggest reason for it is that US is the world reserve currency, US dollar is the world reserve currency. So they get to export inflation, which means that they get to buy goods and services from other countries at the cost of just money printing, which like literally costs nothing to the United States government. And what that does is that they have made them almost dependent on debt. So they are like their main product, their main goods or service is debt itself. That they are promising that these government bonds that they print are the asset that they will pay back on a certain amount of interest. So most major countries are buying US treasury bonds or government bonds or treasury bills because they are the world reserve asset. They are the reserve asset for every country, every central bank on the balance sheet. And what this effectively has done is that a lot of the manufacturing, which was in the US in the 1960s, in the last century, has shifted to those countries because they have cheaper labor. They get the advantage of like exporting inflation because US dollar is the beneficiary of all those goods and services that you buy with those cheap credit, with that new printed money. So the average consumer gets the benefit because they get to buy really cheap products. Like US is able to outcompete every other currency, every other market in the world. So the average US consumer is reaping the benefits. But what it does is that the average US producer, the manufacturer, is facing the cost because for them it becomes very difficult to pay their employees to source products locally. So all the products are being manufactured outside, which is like called the financialization of the entire economy. So the US economy is entirely financialized, which means that they are economy of financial products. The only thing that they are producing is financial product, which is the Wall Street, which is the central bank itself creating new money into supply by buying US dollar debt instruments. And a lot of the countries like China itself, which here says they already hold too much of the debt, which is the debt which they themselves, like the US, have the same economic system or the monetary policy of issuing debt and companies and individuals buying it, but all buying US debt. It's like US debt is the biggest asset that every country holds because US dollar is the world of currency, and the only thing that they have to like buy more of those US dollar debt is selling their goods to them. They are also like dependent on US dollar to sustain their economies because they are the biggest buyers. So it's like a very weird war, which is like called the trade war, that both US and China have become extremely dependent on each other. So it's very difficult for them to cut ties with each other, no matter how much of like enemies they are in terms of global superpowers, because their economies are interdependent. Because US depends on Chinese goods and services, like really cheap manufacturing, and China is dependent on US for funding those manufacturing units that have made China the superpower that they are. Quick pause in case somebody has questions. Hey, AD has joined. I don't think I've interacted with AD before. Yeah, good to have you, AD. So just feel free to ask questions, follow along. Yeah, so US China is the trade war of this century. It's the biggest macroeconomic factor that shifts global orders because most of the US policies have to incorporate Chinese uh, policies themselves because China is not only the second most I mean, Russia and China are probably the only competitors to US hegemony in terms of their superpower, their military power, and even their economic power. So Chinese renminbi and Russian ruble is trying to compete with the dollar. They are not like anywhere close to being successful, but their economies have largely been successful because of US relationship. Because US companies had a lot of manufacturing outsourced to China, and recently I think they have like started to not do that, started to venture into countries like even India, Vietnam, Philippines. So a lot of the manufacturing has started to exit China, and that's mostly because China is now like become more developed than they were even 1 or 2 decades ago. Most of the manufacturing is being hollowed out, even out of China now. There are big pressures for these imbalances to be corrected one way or another, and doing so will change the monetary order in major ways. For example, it is obviously incongruous to have both large trade imbalances and large capital imbalances in a deglobalizing world. in which the major players can't trust that the other major players won't cut them off from the items they need, which is an American worry, or pay them the money they are owed, which is the Chinese worry. Yeah, so order is breaking down as we see it. The biggest example of it was Russian sanctions. So Russia was sanctioned out of the SWIFT system, I think last year, about 1 year ago, or maybe 8 or 9 months ago. And what that created is a very apparent systemic flaw with the global financial system, that if the US does not like you, they can effectively cut you out of the financial system overnight. So, so the major players like Russia, China, US are not trusting each other at this moment in history. And what that does is that it creates yeah, which creates an American worry, because the whole financial economy is working on debt, and if there is no buyer of that debt, you literally come to a point of like what's called technically or economics wise stagflation, that you are at a point in economy where nobody is buying your debt. And on the flip side, the Chinese are worried that if the US does not trust them, does not want to trade with them, then all those US Treasury assets that they hold will be of no value, because the US will not pay back on their debt, pay back on their promise. This is a result of these parties being in a type of war in which self sufficiency is of paramount importance. Anyone who has studied history knows risks under such circumstances have repeatedly led to the same sort of seeing now. So the old monetary economic order in which countries like China manufacture inexpensively, sell to Americans, and acquire American debt assets, and Americans borrow money from countries like China to make those purchases and build up huge debt liabilities, will have to change. These obviously unsustainable circumstances are made even more so by the fact that they have led to American manufacturing deteriorating, both follows out which both hollows out middle class jobs in the US and requires America to import needed items from a country that is increasingly seeing as an enemy, that it is increasingly seeing as an enemy. In an era of deglobalization, these big trade and capital imbalances, which reflect trade and capital interconnectedness, will have to shrink one way or another. Also, it should be obvious that the US government debt level and the rate at which the government debt is being added to is unsustainable. You can find my analysis of this in my new book, How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle. By the way, I checked that this book will be released freely, publicly. Currently, Ray Dalio is only releasing parts of it. Yeah, I've not read his book, How Changing World Order, but it's been like recommended to me by so many people. I've watched the video. It's like a 30-minute or 40-minute video. I'm actually looking to read that book. Clearly, the monetary order will have to change in big disruptive ways to reduce all these imbalances and excesses, and we are in early part of the process of it changing. There are huge capital market implications to this that have huge economic implications, which I will delve into at another time. Time deglobalization, which is becoming the theme of global trade. So the last 3 decades, 4 decades after the Bretton Woods was about globalization, was about greater global trade, and after the petrodollar, uh, what US did was centralize and consolidate a lot of power, because all the trade of oil in the world was happening based on US dollar as the unit of account. What that did is that gave US a lot of power, but because US was the only superpower at the time, and that's the reason that in the Bretton Woods say of like pegging every other currency to US dollar, it was able to create a lot of global trade, because a lot of countries now started using dollar. It was easy to trade with countries because you could use US dollar and US dollar debt assets, which are government bonds, treasury bills, as the reserve assets. So it created an era of globalization where we see unprecedented global trade, which was never seen before in history. But because problem inherent with fiat system is that consolidation of power creates a lot of trust, creates a single point of failure. The US dollar system is breaking before our eyes, and this is creating a deglobalization order, which means that countries are becoming less and less trust trustful of each other, and they are creating what's called like nation state first policies. Like that's the main theme of the current global order. The biggest example of it is Trump, but that's not actually true only for Trump. You will see this with EU. You will see this even with India, and with China especially. This has always been true, that their policies are favoring like production of assets and manufacturing and everything in the economy within the borders of that country. So, from a free market lens, of course, that's a bad thing, but that's the reality that we live in. That most countries are creating what are called protectionist policies, which means that they want all the production to be within the borders of that country. So this is creating a deglobalization order, and this will come with its own friction because of the interconnectedness of the US dollar system, because it is so deeply entrenched. The whole world like relies on this shaky foundation of the US dollar that it's not easy. It's not easy to implement those protectionist policies. And that's why you're seeing the trade war. That's why like Trump is lashing out, and in response, other countries are also lashing out. Yeah. Just see more people have joined. Hello, hello, Godel. Hello, Eaton. Hello, Saurabh.
Hola.
Yep, I think Eaton is joining for the first time. If not, I'm not. I think I might have interacted with you before. Have I?
Oh, Asit.
Oh, yes, yes. Hi, Asit. Great to have you here. So I'll
Hey,
just give
hey.
you an introduction of how we do the Wednesday sessions. It's mostly non-tech articles and books. So we read Bitcoin books and like, basically
Oh,
just
yeah.
have
Yeah,
discussions on them.
I've done one round of this. Yeah,
Okay, super, super, got it. Yeah.
awesome.
So the theme of this session, especially just to people who are joined recently, Saurabh, Asit, and hello Gordon, is understanding what's going on with tariffs. There's so much hue and cry. Like every couple of hours, there's news that China imposed even greater tariffs on the US, and even you see the trending tabs like 104% tariffs. A lot of it is like very ridiculous amounts at this point, and yeah, so this article by Ray Dalio is talking about how tariffs might be trending and they might be the headline of the news, but it's the symptom of a greater problem that's going on, which is like the whole political order is breaking down, the whole monetary system, and no one understands this better than Bitcoiners because it's built on shaky foundation. But the whole order is breaking not because of Bitcoin, but because of the interconnectedness that US and China have with each other. And at this point, like Trump and his protection policies of America First is like taking such a strong hold that the cracks are getting bigger and bigger because he's saying openly that he'll impose greater tariffs because he's saying that the loss of American jobs is because of those countries, is because of like free trade policies of the previous administrations. So he's saying the solution to that is that everything should be produced in the US, and which logically makes sense that if he wants manufacturing to come back to the US, but his immediate actions have been to just arbitrarily start imposing tariffs, making it expensive for Chinese companies and other global companies to sell products to the US. But what it creates is like chaos because companies can't overnight just shift their products to US, and also because the cost is borne by the consumers. So the US consumers are suffering here, and US manufacturing jobs can't be created overnight. So the entire economy is like coming to a standstill. Yeah, there are like so many opinions on this, but we'll cover like couple of articles on this. The idea is to just like open this conversation, and yeah, if you have questions or more research, always feel free to share them later. Yep. The international geopolitical world order is breaking down because the era of one dominant power that dictates the world, the order that other countries follow, is over. The multilateral cooperative world order the US led is being replaced by a unilateral power rules approach. In this new order, the US is still largest power in the world and is shifting to a unilateral America first approach. We are now seeing that manifest in the US led trade war, geopolitical war, technology war, and in some cases, military wars. Acts of nature, droughts, floods, pandemics are increasingly disruptive, and amazing changes in technology such as AI will be highly impactful to all aspects of life, including the money, debt, economic order, the political order, the international order, by affecting interactions between countries economically and militarily, and the cost of acts of nature. So I mentioned before in this session that Ray Dalio has created like a couple of amazing videos. One is how the economic machine works, and one is uh, changing world order, which talks about like world reserve currencies have changed before. What we are witnessing might be the biggest changing world order, but it's definitely not the first. And it's a 200-year-old cycle, like oddly, roughly 200 every 200 years we see a breakdown of the world reserve currency. So his stance on Bitcoin has been mixed. Sometimes he's very positive of China overtaking the US dollar. That's at least the theme of the Changing World Order video on YouTube, which is like very popular. But recently he's becoming more pro Bitcoin. Some of his tweets talked about how Bitcoin is more recognizably, because I think it's just state of the market that this was not true even 2 or 3 years ago, that Bitcoin is becoming more mainstream. So he's also now becoming more pro Bitcoin. Yeah. He's had mixed takes on it. I think even in this article, he does not mention Bitcoin. He mentions that AI is creating a lot of disruption, which is true, of course. Bitcoin, and other than Bitcoin, AI is probably going to have the largest impact on order. But I'm just curious, he actually does not mention Bitcoin in this. Changes in these forces and how they are affecting each other is we should be focusing on. For that reason, I urge you to not let news grabbing dramatic changes like the tariffs draw your attention away from these five big forces and their interrelationships, which are the real drivers of overall big cycle changes. If you allow yourself to be distracted by them, you will A, miss how the conditions and the dynamics of these big forces are causing these news making changes. B, fail to think through how these new making changes will affect the big forces. And C, fail to keep focus on how this overall big cycle and the parts that drive it typically transpire, which will tell you a lot about what is likely to happen. And the overall big cycle that he's referring to is uh, the debt cycle of 80 years. So yeah, in his video, he mentions that every 200 or 250 odd years, the global monetary system starts to break down, and it divides into four cycles of 80 years each. And in those 80 years, it's called the big debt cycle. It's like when there's like huge frenzy of like new money coming flooding the economy. There's a lot of investments, a lot of production, a lot of consumption as well. Everybody feels that the economy is doing good, so that creates like short-term pleasure or short-term like economic activity. But what it comes at the cost of is like larger-term pain. And this overall cycle is yeah, it's affected by these five forces. Mostly it's affected by money printing, and in this video he actually does not call it money printing, he calls it just uh, debt. He just calls it debt, which I think, yeah, it's maybe financially the more correct term, but yeah, if you're a pleb, it just helps to understand money printing is what like creates that debt. It's not debt of one person borrowing the money in the economy. It's debt by creating new money into supply by creating government bonds. Yeah. I also urge you to think about the about the interrelationships that are critically important. For example, think about how Donald Trump's actions on tariffs will affect the monetary market, economic order, it will be disruptive to it. Second, the domestic political order, it will likely be disruptive to it as it will probably undermine his support. Third, the international geopolitical order, it will be disruptive to it in many obvious ways that are financial, economic, political, and geopolitical. Fourth, climate. It will somewhat undermine the world's ability to deal with climate change issue effectively and technology development. It will be disruptive in some positive ways to the US, like bringing more technology production to the US, and in some harmful ways, like being disruptive to the capital markets that are needed to support technology development, and in too many other ways to enumerate here. Yes, the main point, I think, what I can summarize from my understanding is that because of those tariffs, causing companies to like hold back because this is an era of economic uncertainty, because these policies just came out of nowhere during Trump campaign. He mentioned America first, but he did not mention that there will be heavy tariffs like first month into his administration. So what that does is that more and more companies will invest less, and his his purported goal of bringing more manufacturing jobs to the US won't just happen because he slapped tariffs and everybody will like start manufacturing in the US overnight. So this is like, yeah, this point is in specific is interesting that even the domestic political order, it will likely be disruptive to it as it will probably undermine his support. So yeah, there are arguments to be made that this is affecting even Trump's own popularity and his claim to create an America first policy. As you do this, it's helpful to keep in mind what is happening now is just a contemporary version of what has happened innumerable times throughout history. I urge you to study the actions that policymakers took in analogous past cases in which they found themselves in similar positions to help you build a list of things that they might do. Things like suspending debt service payments, to enemy countries, establishing capital controls to prevent the free flow of capital out of the country, and imposing special taxes. Yeah. So I think, yeah, this is where like it sounds, it could be very opinionated, but there are like a lot of proponents of this, that a lot of the reason that these tariffs are happening is not actually to like create manufacturing jobs in the US. It's to do these things, which, like Ray Dalio puts it, has happened in history before. So this is with precedent, that this is like suspending debt service payments. Now Trump has more justifiable case to say, hey, because China is also increasing tariffs, and we are having to engage in trade war, we can suspend debt service payments to them. We don't have to pay our debt back. And like I said before, so Chinese economy and the global economy as well, most central banks are using US Treasury reserve assets as the main asset that backs their currency. Because after Bretton Woods, every currency in the world is backed by the US dollar. So this like gives more political justification to Trump's action to not pay back debt. And yeah, while that sounds good on paper for Trump supporters or America First proponents, that hey, we don't pay back our enemy countries, what this is creating is just a facade for getting away with like creating debt and not paying it back for the financial system to keep on surviving. And yeah, a lot of it, by the way, is my interpretation, my opinion. So please feel free to like counter me, like, or ask questions, or give your own opinions and insights. Establishing capital controls, we are seeing this more and more. This is getting
I,
true in India. This is getting true everywhere.
maybe I
Did
can add
someone say
something
something?
there, Shreyan. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, maybe that's not his plan, but that's how it might turn out. That's how I see it. Because it might not be wise for him to, the promise of U.S. Treasury fails, and then
Yeah,
those things might not really be what he wants to do. But that's how probably most cycles come to an end, because of their
right.
inability to do so. Because they get themselves into a situation where they may not be able to honor those promises that they've made. It could be the death or
Yeah,
the end of a cycle. Uh, it's what I'm saying. It's not
right.
his intent. His intent might still be to get manufacturing jobs, but this is how a large cycle might eventually come to a closure. I think that's what he's trying to say there.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I also think that Ray Dalio is also like stressing on this exact point, that this is not a contemporary version. And yeah, I think intention of Trump, yeah, it makes sense that intention of Trump will not be to not pay back U.S. Treasury based debt, because yeah, that's just more disorder, and no politician will want that on his term. So yeah, that's not his intent. That actually makes a lot of sense. But that might end up happening because, yeah, interestingly, this has happened in history before. Um, not just because the trade wars are getting to the surface every few months, right? Because we're seeing like last year it was Russia, Russian sanctions, and not just Russian sanctions. Even the breaking of the war had a lot of like geopolitical background to it, right? It was not just Russia versus Ukraine, it was Russia versus NATO, and NATO had US backing, was the reason that NATO could even think of like uh, taking that aggression from towards Putin and Russia. So a lot of it is interconnected. This is the global order right now, and this is what is like giving the uh, more justification to protectionist policies. That more and more countries are saying that hey, we need to do every manufacturing within our borders, and yeah, that's what like justifies capital controls, and yeah, justifies debt service payments. And yeah, like Ray Dalio summarizing it, that this all of this is like because of first principles inevitable. It's not because of Trump, it's not because of China, it's just how things are. It's just how things are yeah, leading towards. Many of these things would have been unimaginable not long ago. So we should also study how these policies work. Hmm. Yeah, so many of these things would have been unimaginable not long ago, right? So even like 5 years ago, or even to most of the people right now, right? It does not seem like this is causing world like breaking down of global order, right? The average person does not think of tariffs that way. They think of tariffs, I think, this is just my perception, either in a good sense, Trump supporters are saying, huh, Trump is doing good because it will bring back jobs for US, or they will think that this is bad because Trump is like causing unemployment or like anti-immigration policies because manufacturing jobs are being taken away from China. So this is like the first order symptom that most people think in. So yeah, for them, a lot of this is like not not on the horizon, right? That this is happening, that the entire geopolitical order is breaking down, and this is only a symptom of it. So we should also study how these policies work, the breakdowns in the monetary, political, and geopolitical orders that take the forms of depressions, civil wars, and world wars, that then lead to new monetary political orders that govern interactions within countries, and the geopolitical orders that govern interactions between countries until they break down, have all happened repeatedly and are the most important things to understand well. Yeah, so there are like so many videos. I'm like trying to find the signal in the noise of, like, some people are saying that this is already happening, that China, Russia, and a lot of the countries are creating their own monetary orders already. It's like they're buying more and more gold. China is creating gold-backed yuan. There's BRICS Association, which is creating their own, like, settlement of payments. So recently, because of sanctions on Russia, India was actually an intermediary to help European countries buy Russian oil. So how they did is literally like just a third party payment where India was buying oil from Russia and selling it to Europe. So it's already happening, right? It's already happening that the entire monetary system is not relying or does not want to rely anymore on the dollar. And yeah, we're also literally seeing civil wars and world wars as we speak. Uh, I described them in detail in my book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, so you can see it clearly laid out there. The overall big cycle is described in 6 clearly identifiable stages that unfold as one order becomes the next. It is laid out in such detail that it is easy to compare what is now happening with what typically happens, so it is possible to identify what stage the cycle is in and what is likely to come next. When I wrote that book and my other books, I hoped, as I still do, that I would be able to help policymakers understand these forces and interact with them to produce better policies so we get better results. To help individuals, second, to help individuals who can collectively, but not individually, affect policies to deal with these forces well so they could get better results for themselves and those they care about. And three, to encourage smart people who have different views than mine to have open, thoughtful exchanges with me so that we can all try to get at what is true and what to do about it. And this book, by the way, is freely available as a PDF. Of course, you can buy it, the hardcover, if you want to. But I recently downloaded it. Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. Yeah. So I just wanted to like cover this article. There's another article that I was reading. It's like really good, covers some questions around uh, like what's happening with tariffs. But yeah, I think Ray Dalio is somebody I really admire for being able to explain uh, like chaos using first principles. Take a pause here in case someone has questions. I'll check the chat as well.
Hey, I just wanted to add that you were talking about tariffs and how some supporters of politicians who might impose tariffs justify that by saying that imposing tariffs to the import of foreign goods creates jobs and it boosts local economy. So I'm sure most of you have read or at least heard about this book, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. It's one of the best books I've ever read in economics coming from a non-financial background, in which I believe he has two chapters dedicated just to refute this notion that imposing tariffs on imported products basically enhances local production and creates jobs and nurtures local economy. So he comes up with nice rebuttals. So whoever would like to go through it can access that book. I think it's available on the internet as a PDF in a very easy to understand a layman kind of a language. He explains this notion, or he refutes this notion of tariffs creating local jobs. So whoever would like to read, I'd recommend definitely to go and read those a couple of chapters in that book, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt.
Uh, Faisal, so the argument is that it is not, or what's the argument?
The argument by proponents of tariffs is that it generates local jobs. Like if you're imposing tariffs on imported products, then by default you are like people will be forced to buy products that are manufactured locally, and that will generate a lot of jobs. This is an argument that I hear a lot of politicians furnishing whenever they impose tariffs on imported products.
I think the next article that I wanted to share with you guys actually covers this as well. I'll just quickly first share my screen. Uh, I mean the relevant tab. Yeah, I think just sharing my opinion from a Bitcoin lens, it's pretty interesting that like all of it is unfolding quicker than most Bitcoiners even anticipated, right? Because like the hue and cry or the Bitcoiner news was Bitcoin is now like part of Bitcoin strategic reserve. That's the biggest news. But I think most Bitcoiners realized because this was not US government earning it, this was literally confiscated Bitcoin. So yeah, just my personal opinion that this is more interesting to me than even the strategic Bitcoin reserve news because the cracks are like becoming more and more clear and more exaggerated, right? That the global order is like breaking down almost childishly, right? That the politicians Trump and Xi Jinping are like behaving childishly. They are just imposing tariffs on each other as if that's solving anything, that's creating any economic output or yeah, because they're so interdependent on each other that they realize they can't shut each other down overnight, but they also are forced to act on like policies on from each other. So it's becoming a game of chess more than it's like actually implementing economic policy. It's actually not like benefiting anyone. This is my take on it. Yeah. Can someone confirm if they can see this tab, tariff Q&A? Welcome to the actual inbox. Let me share my screen again. What happened? I can't stop sharing. Wait.
Yes, now it's visible. Kyla's newsletter. You closed it.
Okay, sorry. I will share again. Yeah, so this newsletter actually like covers very nicely. It also mentions the same point that Faisal talked about. And Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt is a very popular book. It was actually recommended to me by a Bitcoiner when I was just starting out. And yeah, it's a very famous book. It's really well written and very simple to understand and covers like 80% of what you need to know. Like almost, I mean, it's a good summary of the entire problem statement. Read this pretty long. I don't think we even need to cover the entire article, but I'll try to cover as much as we can, and we'll just close up with some questions towards the end. Tariff Q&A. Welcome to the Actual Inbox. A brief, comprehensive guide that hopefully answers all your questions. This is Milton Friedman's quote. We call tariff a protective measure. It does protects the consumer very well against one thing. It protects the consumer against low prices. And this is the summary that no tariff ever by China, US, import on export helps anybody. Welcome to a new project. This is the version, blah, blah, blah. This is not important. I've got many questions about a lot of things, which has understandably increased over the last few months. My job is explaining stuff, blah, blah, blah. This is actually not relevant. I've read this before, so I'll just if someone wants to read this, they can, but I don't think it's required. Now let's talk about tariffs. President Trump's newly announced tariffs are sparking all sorts of confusion, and rightfully so. Below, I'll address some questions that have been asked over the past few days over tariffs. I'm sure you have countless notes in your inboxes this morning talking about the tariffs announced by President Trump. The announcement was far more extreme than I think most people are imagining. The tariff situation seems to stem from a series of economic misunderstandings: what tariffs are, what trade deficits are, what reshoring US manufacturing actually means, etc. And ignorance of history. The last time we did mass tariffs was in 1828 and 1930. Smoot-Hawley, and we faced a deepening depression after each one. McKinley, Trump, number one tariff inspiration, did not like tariffs at the end of his time. Yeah, so I'm not aware of 1828, but 1930 is the most is the Great Depression, and yeah, it's times I think roaring 20s and towards 1929 there was the Great Depression. So it just highlights the short-term impact of uh, like money printing or creation of debt, a lot of debt. A lot of people compare this to what's happening right now. Like the early 2020s were a lot of money printing, and the pandemic was just the reason for it, but it was not the cause of it. I think the distinction is that reason because it just justified it because governments had a reason that hey, we need to do this, otherwise the whole economy will be at standstill and people are unemployed. That's when to do it. But the cause of it was that we were getting deeper into debt as the whole economy, and because the whole economy relies on that debt repayment to be done by more money in the economy, greater liquidity, cutting interest rates. So it was inevitable, but it was like accelerated because of the pandemic. Many and yeah, some people are saying that towards the end of this decade, we will see something very similar to the Great Depression, which might or might not like happen how it happened 100 years ago, but what it will result in is like breaking down of the monetary order more and more. Many are trying to rationalize the tariffs by saying that the sharp pain in the economy will be worth it. The companies can find new raw materials and move their supply chains back to the US. The Dallas Fed Manufacturing Survey would disagree with that. That these mass tariffs are just the US version of what G did to China a few years ago. Unfortunately, these tariffs are not paired with any real investment or plan other than punishment, at least at this point. But overall, people are very worried. Trump has plunged the economy into chaos, economic policy uncertainty index. So after global pandemic, according at least to this metric, after 5 years, we are seeing equally or even more uncertainty in the economy. It's all complicated, as Barry Bannister of Stifel said on CNBC. This is pretty much a stagflationary shock, but with a reason. Middle America has been hollowed out. Something like this was bound to happen eventually. People are frustrated, and it is because we have extreme wealth inequality. A lot of people are justifying the tariffs as a way to return wealth to the working class, but the way that these were rolled out, how sweeping they are, and how inflammatory any discussion around them is, it's more likely to make things much harder. But what happens next? What is happening? Are we cooked? President Trump declared a national emergency over what he calls large and persistent US trade deficits. The administration's view is that the US is losing jobs and money because of unfair trade. The White House says that adding tariffs will force companies to bring production back home, thereby boosting US manufacturing and creating more jobs. Yeah, this is the reason, at least publicly, that Trump is portraying. And like some would say, for with good reason, that this is actually what Trump thinks. It's not as if he's using this as an excuse to impose tariffs. He, in his, I mean, to the benefit of his doubt, uh, he's actually like the reason he's doing it is because of this. He's creating more jobs and manufacturing in the US because he believes that unfair trade has occurred in the last decades and years, and the reason for that is that these countries have huge tariffs that the US has to pay, and US is not like applying the same tariff and taxes on those imports. Tariffs are import taxes, and most of the time it's not really the countries that pay for them, it's companies and then usually consumers. As Kathy Jones said, it is the companies importing the goods that pay the tariffs. These then get passed along to consumers as much as possible. It's not really a tariff on the country, it's a tax on the goods imported. Ultimately, all taxes get passed on to the consumer, so it's not the countries that are suffering, it's literally the Chinese companies and the US consumers. That's important to remember here. China isn't really paying the China tariff. It's companies that operate in China and send stuff to the States. These are two main layers to Trump's new tariffs. There are two main layers to Trump's new tariffs. A 10% baseline tariff on most imported goods, effective April 5. So this is like the baseline tariff. And I'm not sure what was previously the tariff, but at least in his new tariffs, 10% is the baseline on any imported goods from April 5. A set of kind reciprocal tariffs that vary country by country, targeting about 60 nations deemed worst offenders, including one nation with 0 people in it. These reciprocal rates kick in on April 9th, presumably to give room for some type of negotiation. So, for example, China's total tariff rate is effectively around 54% on top of older existing tariffs. China has already retaliated with a 34% tariff on all US imports. And this article is literally like 2 days old, and only this evening, this has increased from 34% to 84%. Yeah, I, I read this news just a few hours ago. Canada and Mexico already face 25% tariffs over other disputes, though they are technically not added on to the brand new set. A lot of people have said things along the lines of, well, other countries tariff us, so why shouldn't we tariff them? And this is an adjusted chart of the actual tariff rates countries charge to the US. It's much lower than the White House stated. You can also see this is what we did to Japan. I can quickly show the chart. I'll read this until that loads up. Trade experts in Japan were caught off guard by Trump's 24% tariff on Japanese products, given that Japanese average tariff on non-agricultural goods is approximately 2.4%, among the lowest in the world. So yeah, some people say that Trump is like not just doing this to enemy countries but also to ally countries, which I think this particular tweet talks about Japanese products, which had pretty low tariff on US products, 2.4%, but Trump has applied 24% on Japanese products. This is the chart, the big board that Trump highlighted in his speech. Yeah, yeah, pretty big percentages. So we aren't necessarily cooked, but these tariffs represent a massive shift in trade policy and wild economic calculations. So we could be staring at higher consumer costs, a potential trade war, and an economic slowdown, as I've written about previously. Takeaway: expect near-term turbulence in the form of higher prices, possible retaliation from trading partners, and market volatility. We are not doomed, but the road ahead is bumpy. Yeah, so we're already seeing retaliation from trading partners. We're already seeing market volatility. The last 1 week has been like really volatile. I think some people were tweeting that Bitcoin is now decoupling from the stock market because the entire market was crashing, but Bitcoin was holding steady. But we've seen in the last couple of days, Bitcoin is crashing. And I think gold has been holding, which is like some people say, give the argument that this is why gold has always been the inflation hedge. And it is more and more clear that in times of economic uncertainty, gold performs the best. I live in Cleveland, so the talk of bringing back manufacturing is great. But could these new tariffs really bring jobs, or is it all hype? So yeah, this is some person from Cleveland asking who is like concerned about like bringing back manufacturing for US. It's complicated. Talman Joseph Smith of the NYT has a great in-depth piece exploring the years of underinvestments in places like your home in Cleveland and my home in Kentucky. We need to de-invest in the manufacturing areas that got left behind, but we should dream bigger than making socks and toasters. So, but why do we want to return? After World War II, the US dominated global manufacturing. We were one of the only large industrial bases not destroyed by war, but over decades, Europe and Asia built and innovated. As a share of total employment, manufacturing in the US started steadily shrinking as we focused on other things. Many people see tariffs as a quick fix to revive factories here, but modern manufacturing is highly automated. There are few things to consider. Yeah, so US did have global manufacturing after the World War II. Only after the Bretton Woods did the manufacturing start to exit the US because US could export inflation. They had the world reserve currency at their disposal. That's the biggest tool in their monetary policy. So what that did is that helped them outsource manufacturing. US companies could now get cheap goods and services in exchange for US dollars, in exchange for cheap debt that they could take because US dollar was easy to create, or there was less cost to create it, at least because there was greater trust in it. It was the world reserve currency. Yeah. But yeah, it's not like a quick fix. Tariffs can't be a quick fix to revive factories because of these factors. These are some of the factors. Automation. Robots often do the bulk of the heavy lifting, even in lower wages countries, which could mean fewer jobs per factory because machines do much of the work. Yeah, so like automation and technology is universal, right? Does not depend on which part of the geography you are. So it's like whichever country uses automation and robots best, will actually have most of the manufacturing. So it has nothing to do with trade policy, right? It has got to do with innovation and technology. Global supply chains, companies might shift some operations to Mexico or into the US, but that's expensive and may not create a big wave of new US jobs. It might be cheaper to just eat the tariff translation pass to consumer and continue to produce abroad and just sell the US fewer sneakers at higher prices. This is like the summary of what's the problem. It's like tariffs will eventually just like create more expensive things for consumers because yeah, they will just shift to like Mexico or other countries. Like shifting to US does not just come because of the tariffs. It requires much greater shift in like structure of the economy than just weeding out competition by creating tariffs. Competition, countries like China aren't just churning out cheap, low skill products, they are leaders in advanced manufacturing. Example, robotics, electric vehicles, semiconductors. So it's not just that China has cheap manufacturing because of cheap labor. China has actually built out infrastructure and advanced manufacturing techniques like robotics, like semiconductor industries. So it's not a short time thing, right? China has invested decades and like huge resources into this. They already see automation as an advantage, not a job killer, which is something that the US has struggled with. Um, the UAW opposing automation, for example. If we really want to produce good stuff here, we have to think to the future, not the past. Also, foreign production should be thought of as a complement to domestic production. It helps us make better things here to be able to rely on comparative advantage from abroad. Yeah, this last line is like really stressing on the free market aspect of like global trade, that it helps us make better things here to be able to rely on comparative advantage from abroad. So if you use like free trade and foreign production to your advantage, you can actually make better things in your own like local manufacturing units if you focus on automation and innovation. By the way, just checking the time, we have hit the 9 mark. So what I think we can do, if it's okay with everyone, we'll just cover 5 minutes more. We'll cover like till here, and yeah, we'll just like stop at this question. We don't have to cover all the questions. But yeah, this article is actually a series of question and answers, and yeah, if you're like really looking to understand this deeper, the idea of what tariffs have been doing, how historically they have turned out, this is a good article. There's also pure economics that complicate the reshoring argument. Tariffs will slowly slow down the economy, leading to less investment. Businesses don't make as much money, so they don't build as much. Also, the US is so uncertain now that no one will want to invest here. And also, all the rules might change again in the next election cycle. Yeah, this is like the biggest reaction that like more and more people are seeing, that it's creating more uncertainty than any benefit for one specific industry even. So yeah, there's a good chance that some people say that even in the next 1 2 months we might see Trump like going back on those tariffs. Argentina fell into this trap under Peronism. It was one of the top 10 wealthiest countries in the world in the early 1900s, but they decided that they could do it all alone, tumbled from their posts, and have never recovered. Yeah, this is the other scenario, that US could actually just go down this road, which will be very historic. Takeaway: without sustained industrial policy, think training, tech investment, stable regulations, tariffs alone won't bring a big wave of well-paying manufactured jobs. Yeah, we'll just cover the third question now. I'll just take one like 2 or 3 second pause in case somebody wants to share something. As the administration revealed a scheme for resolving reciprocal tariffs, how did they come up with these numbers? Does the trade deficit matter? As the administration revealed a scheme for resolving the reciprocal tariffs, how did they come up with these numbers? Does the trade deficit matter? I think that this is a good question, because what like give rise to those numbers, right? These arbitrary numbers that just Trump announced, and yeah, does a trade deficit with that country matter in deciding that number? Well, the White House is using a method that basically divided the US trade deficit by total imports from each country. Then it halves that number, calling it the reciprocal tariff rate. Alphaville has a good explainer here. In simpler terms, the bigger the trade deficit the US has with a specific country, the higher the country's tariff gets. But it's a little confusing. So the basic formula that Trump is using is that the bigger the trade deficit, bigger the uh, uh, coming incoming goods, like the more US is consuming from that country, the greater the trade deficit, because US is not exporting as much, is not giving out as much, it's like receiving more, it's importing more, and the higher that the country's tariffs. This is the basic first principle formula that Trump is using. Calculation. So as Bloomberg wrote, China had a trade surplus of 295 billion with the US last year, and on total exports of 438 billion dollars, a ratio of 68%. So divide that by 2 and you get a tariff rate of 34%. Okay, so this is like the metric that was used to come up with the number 34. US comparative advantage. Trump does seem to be quite obsessed with eliminating the trade deficit we have in goods, which would require the US to produce apparel and electronics and somehow grow all types of fruits and vegetables. However, we have had a trade surplus in services like high end manufacturing and finance, which is ideal for an advanced economy. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, like I said, trade deficit is how much you are giving out. Deficit is like negative, it's a negative word. So trade deficit, like just as a, I'm just creating this as a rule of thumb to remember. Trade deficit means when you are importing more than you're exporting. So he wants to eliminate that, which means that US will have to produce these things which they have not been doing. But yeah, when there's trade surplus, which US does have, which is high-end manufacturing and finance. Trade deficits. These don't automatically mean a country is cheating. A trade deficit means we import more from a country than we export to it. This can happen for benign reasons like strong consumer spending, the US dollar's global strength, or the fact that we don't grow certain crops here. Yeah, this paragraph is actually interesting. I'll read this, and we are almost at the end. If we reduce imports from China via high tariffs, we might just buy from Vietnam or another country, likely Latin America, based on tariff rates. The overall deficit just shifts around because we simply cannot produce things like bananas or coffees here. Also, these are countries that send things to us like Cambodia, so we have a giant trade deficit. But it isn't because they are taking advantage of us, it's because they simply can't afford to buy our things. There is no way to even out that deficit, and it really shouldn't be a goal. So it's a weird metric, right? Deficit, because US has the world reserve currency. So when it's buying from a country like Cambodia, it has a trade deficit because Cambodia is importing more than it is getting from US. Like it's providing more goods to US than it is receiving goods from the US. And the reason for that is not because Cambodia is a very surplus country, it's like resource rich. It's because they literally can't afford to buy goods from the US. So they are forced to just serve US by giving their products in exchange for dollars. So effect of that is that US gets into trade deficit with Cambodia, and Trump says that we need to eliminate that. But that absolutely makes no sense because US anyway can't produce bananas and coffee. Yeah, this is the summary of this passage. The world's poorest countries are facing a double headwind of reduced aid and massive tariffs, which could lead to geopolitical instability and the continued rise of China. I'll read this again. The world's poorest countries are facing a double headwind of reduced aid and massive tariffs, which could lead to geopolitical instability. Yeah. This is the part where it's literally like creating like massive geopolitical instability, like wars and like more less trust in countries with each other. Sorry, we're making socks. Yeah, this is like a good summary as well, this tweet. Sorry, we're making socks 18% more expensive for American families to punish Bangladeshi families with an annual income of $900 for not buying enough Herman Miller chairs, Viking ranges, and Steinway pianos. These like US brands which Bangladesh anyway can't afford, and they can't afford. So the response that Trump comes up is making 18% more expensive for the consumers of US to be able to buy from these families, and now these families are not able to serve those consumers. Yeah, most of those companies will eat part of the cost. Takeaway: a trade deficit isn't automatically evidence of wrongdoing. Targeting it through broad tariffs can lead to supply chain reshuffles rather than genuine return of production to the US. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for listening in. If you have questions um, or thoughts or comments, so thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Dhruval. Thank you, Fineng. Thank you, Jatin, Saurabh.